Imagine walking into a building where the concrete walls are 4 feet thick, the hallways are designed like prison corridors, and 27,000 people are crammed into 95 acres of land, making it more densely packed than the slums of Hong Kong. This was Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago. Built for $2.8 billion in federal money, it became the largest public housing experiment in human history. But here's what they didn't tell you. Internal planning documents reveal it was never meant to house people. It was meant to warehouse them. The architects who designed these towers knew exactly what they were creating. 4-foot-wide hallways that would become territorial choke points. Single elevators serving 16 floors of families. Stairwells designed like military bunkers. Every blueprint, every specification, every cost-cutting measure was calculated to create the perfect conditions for what would happen next. For 30 years, these concrete monoliths stood as monuments to social engineering gone wrong. But the most shocking part isn't what happened inside these buildings. It's the paper trail that proves they worked exactly as intended. Today, we're opening the classified files on America's most profitable urban experiment. We're going to examine the blueprints, follow the money, and trace the decisions that transformed 33,000 residents into prisoners of their own homes. If you're ready to see how power really works in American cities, if you want to understand the machinery behind our urban crisis, then subscribe and join us as we dissect the anatomy of a system that turned human misery into political profit. The towers are gone, but the machine that built them is still running. Estate to political allies. The federal government would even pay ongoing subsidies to house the concentrated poor, creating a permanent revenue stream from human misery. But they needed to make it look like urban progress. Enter Le Corbusier, the Swiss architect whose radiant city concept promised to house the masses in efficient concrete towers surrounded by green space. His manifestos spoke of machines for living, vertical cities that would free humanity from the chaos of street-level urban life. European intellectuals hailed him as a visionary. American housing officials saw him as the perfect cover story. The blueprints that emerged from those closed-door meetings were marvels of calculated efficiency. 16-story towers housing 150 families each. Narrow hallways exactly 4 feet wide, just enough for 2 people to pass if they turned sideways. Single elevators serving 16 floors of residence. Minimal common space, minimal storage, minimal everything except the federal subsidies that would pour in based on the sheer number of units crammed into each acre. Internal architectural reviews warned about territorial bottlenecks and security vulnerabilities. The narrow hallways and single exit stairwells violated every safety protocol, except the ones written specifically for public housing. But those warnings cost money to address. $400,000 per building, to be precise. And corner cutting was the entire point. The site they selected for the largest experiment sat along the Dan Ryan Expressway on the south side. 95 acres of relatively cheap land where they could build 28 identical towers in perfect formation. They would call it the Robert Taylor Homes, after a black housing activist who had fought for integrated neighborhoods. The irony was apparently lost on the planners. Construction began in the spring of 1962 with the efficiency of a military operation, 1,200 workers laboring in 16-hour shifts. Concrete poured 24 hours a day for 18 consecutive months. The sound was deafening, a constant industrial symphony of jackhammers and diesel engines and steel on steel that neighbors described as the sound of the future being built. The towers rose like a concrete wall along the expressway, and that metaphor was more literal than anyone wanted to admit. Internal planning documents revealed the true purpose of their placement, to create a visual and psychological barrier separating the South Side from downtown Chicago. White commuters speeding north on the Dan Ryan would see an impenetrable wall of public housing, a constant reminder of where the city had decided to warehouse its unwanted population. But the most sinister detail was hidden in the foundation pour itself. To save money, always to save money, contractors mixed their concrete with substandard aggregate. The savings amounted to less than $50,000 across all 28 buildings. But those hairline cracks that appeared in the basement of the first completed tower were the physical manifestation of a deeper flaw. They had built their monuments to efficiency on foundations designed to fail. In September of 1962, Mayor Daley himself appeared for the ribbon-cutting ceremony at Robert Taylor Homes. Federal housing officials flew in from Washington. Carefully selected model families were photographed, moving into apartments that had been staged with middle-class furnishings borrowed from department stores. The media coverage was breathless in its enthusiasm. America's largest public housing development, a 21st-century solution to 19th-century problems. Progress made concrete. The photographs from that day show smiling children playing in manicured courtyards, clean hallways with fresh paint and gleaming floors, apartments with modern appliances and picture windows offering views of the Chicago skyline. It looked like the future Le Corbusier had promised, vertical villages where working families could build better lives. What the cameras didn't show were the 90% of apartments that came completely empty. No appliances, no fixtures, sometimes no working plumbing or heating. Families who had been promised modern conveniences found themselves living in conditions worse than the slums they had left behind. But by then, those slums had been bulldozed, leaving them with nowhere to go but up. The first elevator breakdown happened within 72 hours of opening day. An elderly woman trapped between the 8th and 9th floors for 6 hours, calling for help that wouldn't come because the building's intercom system had never been installed. When maintenance crews finally freed her, she was suffering from dehydration and panic attacks. The elevator was fixed, but the message was clear. This was what efficiency looked like when you cut too many corners. Still, for those first 3 years, the towers almost worked. 85% occupancy rate, active tenant councils organizing community events and security patrols, children playing in supervised playgrounds while their parents attended job training classes in the community centers. There was even a waiting list, 14,000 families desperate to move into what they still believed might be their gateway to a better life. The towers functioned precisely as their architects had intended, not as temporary shelter, but as permanent communities. Internal CHA mortgage documents projected 50-year payment schedules, revealing that despite all the talk of helping families transition out of public housing, the real plan was to keep them there indefinitely. But that golden period was built on a policy foundation as unstable as the concrete beneath the towers. Federal housing law had originally required that 20% of public housing residents earn middle-class incomes, creating mixed-income communities that could sustain themselves economically. Working families paid higher rents that subsidized their poorer neighbors. Children had employed parents as role models. Communities had the economic diversity that made them resilient. In 1965, that policy changed. Federal housing officials, responding to pressure from civil rights groups who argued that income caps excluded the neediest families, eliminated the requirement for economic integration. The change was well-intentioned, rooted in the genuine desire to help the most desperate Americans find shelter. The practical effect was catastrophic. Within 2 years, every working family with options had moved out of the towers. Why stay in public housing when your income qualified you for a mortgage in a neighborhood with better schools and lower crime? Why raise your children in high-rise buildings when you could afford a house with a yard? By 1968, Robert Taylor homes housed only the families who had literally nowhere else to go. Single mothers with multiple children, elderly residents on fixed incomes, disabled individuals who couldn't work, the economically desperate who had been pushed out of every other neighborhood by urban renewal and highway construction. The towers had become exactly what their critics had always feared: warehouses for the unwanted. But they had also become something their designers had never anticipated: perfect laboratories for studying what happens when you concentrate desperation at a density of 114,000 people per square mile. The social fabric that had held the early community together began to unravel with mathematical precision. Tenant councils collapsed when working families moved away. Security patrols disbanded when residents could no longer afford to volunteer their time. Community centers closed when there was no longer a community to serve. And in the silence left behind, new forms of organization began to emerge. Organizations that understood the tower's architecture better than their builders ever had. Organizations that recognized opportunity in the narrow hallways and single-exit stairwells and broken elevator systems that trapped residents on upper floors. The Chicago police would later describe what happened next as the most efficient criminal enterprise in American history. But they missed the point entirely. The towers hadn't been captured by criminals. They had been designed for them all along. The first gang tags appeared in the stairwells of Robert Taylor homes in the winter of 1968, spray-painted hieroglyphs that might have seemed like random vandalism to casual observers. But residents quickly learned to read them like a survival manual. Red crowns marked Gangster Disciples territory. Blue stars belonged to the Black Pea Stones, and the intricate system of numbers and symbols that covered every surface told a more complex story: which floors were safe at which times of day, which stairwells to avoid after dark, which elevators had become mobile prisons where anything could happen between floors. The gangs hadn't invaded the towers. They had evolved inside them, like organisms adapting to a unique ecosystem. The building's architecture had created the perfect conditions for territorial control: vertical spaces that could be defended from multiple angles, choke points that funneled foot traffic through predictable patterns, and sight lines that allowed lookouts to spot law enforcement from 16 floors away. Sociologist Lee Rainwater, studying the psychological effects of high-rise living, made a disturbing discovery. Mothers in tower apartments developed what he called, quote, 3 times faster than mothers in row houses. The vertical isolation literally rewired the brain for despair. When you can't see your children playing outside, when you can't monitor who enters your building, when the sound of footsteps in the hallway could mean anything from a neighbor coming home to a drug deal going wrong, the human mind begins to shut down its capacity for hope. But children, as always, adapted faster than adults. A generation of kids grew up treating gang territories like video game levels, learning to navigate the tower's vertical maze with the precision of urban warriors. They developed elaborate games around the violence. Red light, green light became a real survival skill for timing movements between gunshots. Hide and seek taught them which stairwells offered genuine concealment and which were kill zones. Jump rope helped them develop the rhythm needed to time their sprints across gang boundaries. The most haunting discovery was what happened to their spatial reasoning abilities. Child psychologists testing tower kids found they scored 15% lower on navigation tests than children from horizontal neighborhoods. Their mental maps were entirely vertical. They could describe every floor of their building in photographic detail, but they couldn't find their way around a suburban mall. The towers had created a generation of children who thought the world was supposed to be stacked on top of itself. Meanwhile, the buildings themselves were dying from the inside out. The Chicago Housing Authority had calculated that maintaining the towers properly would cost approximately $12 million per year. But their actual maintenance budget was $3.7 million, less than a third of what the buildings needed to remain habitable. The math was simple and brutal. It was cheaper to let the towers decay and collect federal emergency funding than to maintain them as functional housing. Each broken elevator cost $35,000 to repair, but generated $200,000 in lost rent revenue as families fled. Each failed heating system during a Chicago winter meant emergency shelter costs that the federal government would eventually reimburse. Each security door that broke and went unfixed was another opportunity to document, quote, that justified additional funding. The towers had become more profitable when they failed than when they succeeded. The cascade of infrastructure collapse followed a predictable pattern. First, the elevators, trapping elderly residents on upper floors for days at a time. Then the heating systems, forcing families to use kitchen ovens for warmth during sub-zero winters. Then the plumbing, creating waterfalls of sewage that flowed down stairwells like urban rivers. Then the electrical systems, plunging entire floors into darkness that became permanent when repair crews refused to enter the buildings. But the most devastating failure was less visible, the collapse of what urban planners call, quote, 10. The towers had been designed with minimal common areas to maximize apartment count per acre. No lobbies where residents could gather and monitor who entered their building. No porches where neighbors could observe street activity. No mailboxes grouped together where residents might encounter each other daily. The architecture had systematically eliminated every opportunity for natural community formation. Drug dealers understood this better than the building's architects ever had. They established operations in vacant apartments with military precision, lookouts posted on every floor, stash houses hidden in units that still had working utilities, and escape routes mapped through connected basements that honeycombed beneath the towers like underground highways. Federal Drug Enforcement Administration analysis would later reveal that Cabrini Green's central courtyard, known to residents as, quote, 11, quote, processed over $1 million in drug transactions per week. That made it more profitable per square foot than the Chicago Board of Trade. The towers hadn't just concentrated poverty. They had concentrated the underground economy that poverty creates. The residents caught in the middle developed survival strategies that turned everyday activities into military operations. Grocery shopping required armed escorts or careful timing around gang shift changes. Laundry trips happened only in groups, with mothers forming informal security details to protect each other during the dangerous journey to basement facilities. Families stockpiled food and water to minimize their exposure to hallway violence. Children learned to sleep in bathtubs to avoid stray bullets that could penetrate apartment walls. Mothers created elaborate communication networks using kitchen windows and hand signals, flashing coded messages about gunfire, police raids, and gang movements. The maternal early warning system operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a desperate attempt to protect families in buildings that had been designed to make protection impossible. Insurance companies began refusing coverage for ambulances, fire trucks, and mail delivery to the towers. The buildings had been effectively declared foreign territory within the city of Chicago. When residents called 911, dispatchers would often put them on hold indefinitely, hoping the caller would hang up rather than force emergency responders into what had become urban combat zones. The breaking point came on a cold October morning in 1981. A sniper had taken position in a vacant apartment in Cabrini Green's 1230 North Burling building. From his perch on the 15th floor, he had a commanding view of the courtyard below and the approaches from every direction. When the first shot rang out, hitting a police officer in the shoulder, Residents initially thought it was just another drug deal gone wrong. But this was different. This was systematic. For 48 hours, the sniper held an entire development hostage. 30 shots fired at anyone who moved through his field of vision. Police officers, residents, even children trying to reach the school bus. SWAT teams surrounded the building, but they quickly discovered what gang members had known for years. The towers were impossible to secure. With hundreds of vacant apartments, multiple roof access points, and connected basement tunnels, one determined individual could control territory that housed 15,000 people. The sniper moved between apartments like a ghost, always staying one step ahead of the tactical teams trying to corner him. When the siege finally ended, the sniper simply vanished, never to be identified or caught. Residents emerged from their apartments to find their world had fundamentally changed. The lockdown had made official what they had long suspected. They were prisoners in their own homes. Ballistics analysis of the recovered bullets revealed a detail that sent shockwaves through law enforcement. The rifle had been stolen from the Chicago Police Department's own evidence locker. The towers had become so lawless that even police weapons were being turned against law enforcement. But the most devastating revelation came from the demographic data collected during the crisis. The siege had trapped 15,000 people in conditions that violated every standard of human habitation. No working elevators, no heat during a Chicago winter, no mail delivery, garbage collection, or emergency services. For 2 days, Robert Taylor Homes and Cabrini Green had effectively ceased to be part of the United States, and yet people continued to live there because they had nowhere else to go. Middle-class families who still had options began a mass exodus that resembled wartime refugees fleeing an occupied city. Between 1981 and 1983, vacancy rates spiked to 40%, leaving behind only the most desperate residents who literally could not afford to move anywhere else. The empty apartments became crack houses, gang headquarters, and dumping grounds for bodies. Entire floors went dark as utilities were cut to units that no longer generated rental income. The towers began to resemble vertical ghost towns, with islands of occupied apartments surrounded by floors of urban ruins. Chicago Housing Authority officials stopped reporting accurate crime statistics because the numbers were so horrific they would have triggered federal intervention. Internal documents that surfaced years later revealed the true scope of the catastrophe: 1 murder per week in Robert Taylor Homes alone. Rape rates that exceeded those of maximum security prisons. Child mortality rates that matched those of developing nations. The towers had achieved a grim mathematical precision. They had become more dangerous than the worst neighborhoods they had been designed to replace. And still, the concrete walls rose into the Chicago sky, monuments to the arrogance of social engineering. Each morning, residents who had survived another night would look out their windows at a city that seemed to exist in another universe, a place where elevators worked, where children played safely, where the simple act of walking to school didn't require tactical planning. The towers had become America's most efficient machines for manufacturing despair. But they had also revealed something darker about American intentions toward the poor, something that would haunt urban policy for generations to come. The horror wasn't that the system had broken down. The horror was that it was working exactly as designed. The crack epidemic hit Chicago's housing projects like a biological weapon designed specifically for vertical architecture. By 1983, the narrow hallways that architects had designed for efficiency had become trafficking corridors more sophisticated than anything the cartels had built in Colombia. Gang members established a vertical supply chain that operated with the precision of a Fortune 500 company. Lookouts on the roof, middle management on every third floor, street-level dealers working the courtyards, and security teams controlling the single elevators that funneled all commerce through predictable choke points. Dr. James Garbarino, a child psychologist studying urban violence, made a discovery that would haunt him for decades. Children living in the towers showed stress hormone levels identical to those found in combat veterans. 8-year-olds demonstrated hypervigilance patterns typically seen in soldiers returning from active war zones. The human body couldn't distinguish between Beirut and Robert Taylor homes. Trauma was trauma, whether delivered by artillery shells or drive-by shootings. Emergency room physicians at nearby hospitals developed specialized treatment protocols for what they called, quote, 13, a medical category that hadn't existed before the buildings opened. Gunshot wounds from high-velocity weapons, injuries from falls down concrete stairwells during panicked escapes, burns from space heaters used when heating systems failed, and a new phenomenon that doctors struggled to categorize: psychological wounds from witnessing violence that no child should ever see. The towers had become America's most efficient trauma factories, processing damaged human beings at an industrial scale. Residents developed their own informal economy of survival. Water carriers who climbed 16 flights of stairs to deliver drinking water to elderly residents, trapped when elevators failed. 50 cents per gallon, paid in food stamps or whatever currency desperation could offer. Unofficial security guards who patrolled stairwells in exchange for groceries, creating safe windows for families to venture out of their apartments. Quote Fortito Rursa, who braved gang territory to get supplies for disabled residents, charging hazard pay that was cheaper than the ambulance rides that wouldn't come anyway. Mothers created the most sophisticated early warning network in urban America. Kitchen windows became observation posts. Hand signals flashed between buildings carried coded messages about gunfire patterns, police movements, and gang territory shifts. The maternal intelligence system operated 24 hours a day, a desperate attempt to predict and avoid violence in buildings designed to make violence inevitable. But it was the children who developed the most disturbing adaptations. Sociologist Sudhir Venkatesh, studying daily life in the towers, documented how kids created elaborate games around mortal danger. Sniper wasn't a video game. It was a real survival skill that taught children to identify safe routes between buildings based on sight lines and cover opportunities. They learned to read the acoustic signatures of different weapons, distinguishing between handguns, rifles, and automatic weapons by sound alone. 10-year-olds could diagram the gang territories of their building with the precision of military cartographers. The psychological toll was measurable in ways that still shock researchers today. IQ scores in tower children dropped an average of 8 points between kindergarten and 5th grade, not because of any genetic factor, but because chronic stress literally shrunk the parts of their brains responsible for learning and memory. The towers were making children stupider, simply by exposing them to constant fear. Federal agents attempting drug raids discovered that traditional law enforcement was impossible in vertical territories. Gang members could see police approaching from 16 floors away and had dozens of escape routes through connected basements that stretched for city blocks underground. A single raid required coordinating hundreds of officers to seal every possible exit, and even then, suspects could simply disappear into the maze of vacant apartments that honeycombed every building. DEA analysis revealed that the towers processed more drugs per square foot than any other location in North America. The quote 16 at Cabrini Green, a central courtyard surrounded by 4 high-rise buildings, generated over $50 million in annual drug revenue. That was more economic activity than most suburban shopping malls, all of it concentrated in a space smaller than a football field. The mathematics of desperation had created the perfect criminal laboratory. Chicago police brass, frustrated by their inability to maintain order in vertical territories, quietly implemented a policy that would later be revealed in federal court documents: containment. Rather than attempting to eliminate drug trafficking in the towers, they would simply ensure it stayed there. Officers patrolled the perimeter, but rarely entered the buildings unless responding to murders that might spill into surrounding neighborhoods. The towers had become free fire zones within the city limits, places where normal law didn't apply because normal law was impossible to enforce. Residents trapped inside developed what psychologists call siege mentality, the same psychological adaptations found in populations living under military occupation. Families stockpiled food to avoid leaving their apartments. Children learned to identify safe times for bathroom trips based on gang shift patterns. Elderly residents died alone in their apartments because neighbors were too afraid to check on them, and bodies sometimes weren't discovered for weeks. Insurance companies stopped covering medical emergencies in the towers, effectively declaring them no man's lands. When residents suffered heart attacks or went into labor, their families had to carry them down 16 flights of stairs and across gang territories to reach the nearest hospital. The towers had been abandoned by every institution that makes civilization possible. But the most devastating abandonment came from the Chicago Housing Authority itself. Internal budget documents revealed the economic logic driving the towers' decay. Properly maintaining the buildings would cost approximately $12 million annually, but allowing them to deteriorate while collecting federal emergency subsidies generated nearly $15 million in revenue. The towers were more profitable when they failed than when they functioned. Engineering reports that surfaced during later federal investigations showed that by 1985, the structural integrity of every building was compromised. The substandard concrete poured during construction had developed cracks that spread through load-bearing walls like cancer. Water damage from broken plumbing had weakened steel support beams. The buildings were literally falling apart from the bottom up, threatening collapse that could kill hundreds of residents. But demolition would mean admitting that the entire public housing experiment had failed, and failure would mean losing billions in federal subsidies that had become essential to Chicago's political machine. So the towers stood, crumbling monuments to bureaucratic inertia and human expendability. Federal court orders demanding that CHA make the buildings livable or close them were ignored with impunity. City officials had discovered that violating federal housing law carried no meaningful penalties. Judges could issue orders, but they couldn't force politicians to spend money they didn't want to spend or relocate people they didn't want to house. The towers had revealed a fundamental truth about American urban policy. The poor were valuable only as long as they stayed contained and invisible. The moment they demanded actual services or threatened to disperse into middle-class neighborhoods, they became a problem to be managed rather than human beings to be helped. By 1990, the towers housed populations denser than the worst slums in Calcutta, but with violence rates that exceeded those of active war zones. Residents had developed survival skills that would have impressed military special forces, but their children couldn't read at grade level because schools had been abandoned along with everything else. The towers had achieved their true purpose with mathematical efficiency. They had concentrated America's unwanted population in spaces designed for maximum control and minimum cost. They had extracted billions in federal subsidies while providing minimal actual housing, and they had created a permanent class of urban refugees who could be alternately ignored and exploited as political conditions required. The concrete walls still rose into the Chicago sky, but they no longer housed communities. They warehoused the casualties of social engineering, human beings who had been transformed into statistical abstractions in someone else's urban planning equation. And deep in City Hall, officials were already drafting the next phase of the plan. Because the towers had served their function perfectly, not as housing, but as a demonstration that the poor deserved exactly what they had received. The demolition would be the final act of a 30-year con game. But first, the buildings had to become so uninhabitable that even their residents would beg to see them destroyed. The machine was working exactly as designed. The controlled demolition of the first tower at Cabrini Green on March 30th, 1995, drew crowds like a medieval execution. Mayor Richard M. Daley, son of the man who had built the towers, stood behind a podium draped in red, white, and blue bunting, flanked by federal housing officials and real estate developers who had waited 30 years for this moment. Television cameras captured the spectacle from every angle as 10,000 pounds of carefully placed explosives reduced 16 stories of concrete and steel to rubble in 12 seconds. The symbolism was perfect. The failure of public housing made visible. Progress through destruction. The future built literally on the grave of the past. What the cameras didn't capture were the engineering reports that documented what those explosives revealed. The concrete crumbled like sand, disintegrating so completely that demolition crews later described it as, quote, 18 Steel reinforcement bars that should have lasted a century had rusted through in 30 years. Foundation problems were so severe that structural engineers estimated the buildings would have collapsed on their own within another decade. Each tower cost $500,000 to demolish, more than twice what it had cost to build. The debris was so contaminated with lead, paint, asbestos, and environmental toxins that it had to be treated as hazardous waste and trucked to special disposal sites in other states. The towers had become poisonous even in death, but the real devastation wasn't visible until the dust settled and 33,000 residents found themselves scattered across metropolitan Chicago like refugees from a natural disaster. The Great Dispersal, as sociologists would later call it, was supposed to solve the problems that concentration had created. Section 8 housing vouchers would allow former tower residents to move into working-class neighborhoods where their children could attend better schools, where they could escape the cycle of violence that vertical segregation had created, where they could finally access the American dream that had been denied them for 3 decades. The reality was far more complex and considerably more cruel. Landlords across the metropolitan area quickly learned to spot Section 8 applicants and developed elaborate screening processes designed to exclude them. No vouchers accepted became the unofficial motto of every decent neighborhood within 50 miles of the Loop. Families with housing vouchers found themselves competing for apartments in the same high-crime, under-resourced neighborhoods they had tried to escape, just at ground level instead of 16 stories up. Gang territories followed the families like shadows. Disciples and stones who had controlled different towers for decades suddenly found themselves living on the same suburban block, their children attending the same schools, their territorial disputes transplanted to communities that had no infrastructure for managing urban warfare. Suburban police departments that had never dealt with anything more serious than drunk driving found themselves responding to drive-by shootings and drug-related homicides. Crime rates in the neighborhoods that received tower refugees increased proportionally to the number of families relocated there. But crime rates in the former tower sites dropped dramatically, confirming what researchers had suspected all along. The towers hadn't created criminals, they had simply concentrated them. Dispersal didn't solve the problem, it redistributed it across a wider geographic area. The children bore the heaviest burden of the transition. Kids who had never lived anywhere but the towers suddenly found themselves in suburban schools that had no idea how to help students who had learned to duck gunfire before they learned to read. Teachers discovered that many tower children suffered from post-traumatic stress so severe it made traditional classroom instruction impossible. 8-year-olds who could navigate gang territories with military precision couldn't focus on homework because any unexpected noise triggered fight-or-flight responses. Educational psychologists studying the dispersal found that tower children actually performed worse academically after moving to, quote, 20 schools. The cognitive load of adapting to entirely new social environments, learning suburban social codes, adjusting to integrated classrooms, processing their own trauma while pretending to be, quote, 21, quote, overwhelmed their capacity for academic learning. Many dropped out within 2 years of leaving the towers. 5 years after the first demolitions, researchers tracking former tower families made a devastating discovery. Most residents were significantly worse off than they had been in the projects. They were more isolated, in more unstable housing situations, with less access to social services and community support networks. The towers had been hell, but they had been a familiar hell where residents had developed survival strategies and mutual aid networks. Dispersal had destroyed those adaptations without replacing them with anything better. Meanwhile, the vacant lots where the towers once stood became the focus of the most aggressive gentrification campaign in Chicago's history. Real estate developers who had been circling the sites since the 1960s finally swooped in with plans that would have made the original urban renewal architects proud. The near north side location of Cabrini Green, within walking distance of Michigan Avenue's shopping district, was rezoned for luxury mixed-use development. Property values increased 2,000% between 1995 and 2005, making the tower's demolition one of the most profitable urban renewal projects in American history. The new developments featured architectural details that deliberately contrasted with the towers they replaced. Low-rise buildings with abundant green space, private security systems that required key cards and facial recognition, retail spaces filled with boutiques and coffee shops that catered to the young professionals who could afford $3,000 per month studio apartments on land where families had once lived in federal housing. The irony was lost on no one who understood the history. The same acre of land that had been too valuable for poor families in 1940 was now too valuable for middle-class families in 2005. The towers had served as a 50-year placeholder, warehousing an unwanted population until market conditions made luxury redevelopment profitable. Former tower residents, now scattered across the metropolitan area, could only watch from afar as their former neighborhoods transformed into urban playgrounds for the wealthy. They had been removed not because the towers were uninhabitable, although they certainly were, but because the land beneath them had become too valuable for public housing. The psychological autopsies that followed revealed the tower's true purpose with surgical precision. Academic studies analyzing 30 years of housing policy data concluded that the towers had never been intended to help poor families escape poverty. They had been designed to contain those families geographically while extracting maximum federal subsidies for politically connected developers, contractors, and city officials. Every aspect of their design, from the density that maximized subsidy payments to the isolation that prevented political organization, had served those goals perfectly. Economic analysis showed that the $2 billion spent building and maintaining the towers could have provided every resident family with a $60,000 down payment on a house in a working-class neighborhood. But dispersed home ownership would have eliminated the concentrated political control that made the towers valuable to Chicago's machine politics. Poor families who owned their own homes in integrated neighborhoods couldn't be counted on to vote as a bloc or provide the kind of reliable electoral base that concentrated poverty delivered. The towers had been a form of political technology disguised as housing policy. But the most disturbing discovery came from genetic researchers studying the long-term health effects of tower life. Second- and third-generation families carried measurable trauma markers in their DNA, epigenetic changes that affected everything from stress hormone production to immune system function. The towers had literally altered the genetic expression of their residents, creating health disparities that would persist for generations even after the buildings were gone. Children whose grandparents had lived in the towers showed elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and learning disabilities, even if they had never set foot in public housing themselves. The trauma of vertical segregation had been encoded into their genetic material like a molecular memory of oppression. GPS mapping studies revealed an even stranger phenomenon. Former tower residents who had been scattered across the suburbs were unconsciously recreating the social networks that had sustained them during the worst years of Project Life. They found each other in new neighborhoods, established informal mutual aid systems, and built communities that functioned remarkably well, but only when they were free from the architectural constraints that had made those same social bonds survival mechanisms in the towers. The people had never been the problem. The buildings had been the problem. But the buildings had been designed to make the people look like the problem, creating a perfect circular logic that blamed victims for the systems that victimized them. As America entered the 21st century, facing new housing crises in cities across the country, urban planners began quietly dusting off the architectural blueprints that had created Chicago's towers. High-density housing, efficient use of urban land, cost-effective solutions for managing homeless populations. The language was more sophisticated, the designs more aesthetically pleasing, but the fundamental logic remained unchanged. Concentrate the poor, extract federal subsidies, preserve valuable land for future development. Blame the residents when the system inevitably fails. The concrete walls of Chicago's housing projects had been reduced to rubble, but the machine that created them was still running, still efficient, still profitable. The towers were gone, but the tower mentality lived on in policy papers and planning documents and budget meetings where human beings were reduced to numbers in spreadsheets. Somewhere in the offices of America's housing authorities, officials were calculating square footage per resident and subsidy payments per unit, and the optimal density for warehousing the unwanted. The mathematics of social engineering continued, as cold and precise as the concrete that had once risen into the Chicago sky. The towers had fallen, but their legacy endured in the spaces between buildings, in the scattered families still carrying trauma in their genes, in the luxury condos built on poisoned ground, and in the next generation of architects who would promise that this time they could engineer away poverty with better blueprints and more efficient designs. The machine was ready to build again,